Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. For my returning viewers, welcome back. We are on case number 15 and I have another unsolved case for you all today. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second and hit that button to support the channel. I will be talking about the death of a very young 4-year-old little boy. I understand that there are a lot of people who don't want to listen to a child case for obvious reasons. If you are one of those people, I completely understand and I don't blame you if you click out of this video. Hopefully I'll catch you in another video, or you all can check out my solved and unsolved playlist available on the channel if you have a chance. Child murders are extremely difficult. They never get any easier, and on top of this case involving a very young and innocent child, it is also an extremely frustrating case because 2 other innocent boys were accused of his murder and had to live with these accusations for almost 20 years. This case is a complete shit show, investigation-wise. So many mistakes were made to the point where it's completely ridiculous. I do want to apologize in advance when it comes to my pronunciation on some of the names that are involved with this case. If anyone happens to be Swedish, please correct me down below. I've tried my best to find the pronunciation for the names, but I'll be honest, sometimes I feel like I can barely speak English, the only language I know, so again, I'm sorry if I suck at saying these names. Bear with me on that, but let's go ahead and get into this case. This is the unsolved case of Kevin Hjalmarsson. Kevin Hjalmarsson was born on October 12, 1993 in Arvika, Sweden. Kevin was often described as a very happy and playful little boy. He was always recognized in his neighborhood as the sweet little boy riding his red bike, waving to the neighbors who crossed his path. Kevin was an extremely friendly child. He consistently, without any interruption, would go outside every single day. He would ride around the neighborhood and would ask every kid he saw if they wanted to play with him. He was just an absolute sweetheart and only ever wanted to play and have fun with anyone who would let him. The residential neighborhood Kevin had lived at was located near the shores of the Kraviken Bay. This was a very small, close-knit community where everyone knew and trusted each other, and because there was so much trust within this neighborhood, it was very common for the local children to travel around the small neighborhood without any supervision. Kevin would often be one of the many kids who did this daily. Mind you, this is a 4-year-old little boy. I understand that this was a very close community that generally trusted each other, but even so, a child within that age range has no business going off on his own, in my opinion. I don't even have kids yet, but I know I would never, ever allow my children to ride their bikes around town alone. I don't care how safe the community is deemed or if I know every neighbor. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we don't know a person's true intentions. We don't know what our neighbor is capable of doing. It was Sunday, August 16th, 1998, the last day of summer vacation before school returned the next day. It was a bright and sunny day, a perfect day for Kevin to ride his bike and look around for other kids to play with him. Kevin made his way around the neighborhood as normal. He played with a couple of different kids that morning. These kids were frequent playmates of his, and he played with them until it was early afternoon. Kevin came home to eat lunch at his grandparents' house, and after he ate, he asked his mother if he could go back out on his bike and find more kids to play with. His mother agreed to let him go back out, but told him not to be out too late and to be home before it was time for dinner. Kevin then headed back out with his red bike to search for more kids to play with. But this would be the last time that Kevin's mother and his grandparents would see him alive. A few hours passed and Kevin Hjalmarsson failed to return back home for dinner around 6:30 p.m. When he didn't show up, his mother immediately became worried because Kevin never came home late, especially when his mother specifically told him to not come home late that day. Right away, his mother and his grandparents began searching the neighborhood for Kevin. They looked for him in the usual places he was known to go to. This included the local playgrounds, schools, and football fields, but they couldn't find him in any of these places. As more and more time went by, his family grew more and more worried. They asked the neighbors who happened to be outside if they had seen Kevin, but no one had seen him for a couple of hours at this point. By now it was starting to get dark, but they continued to search. The search eventually came to the Kraviken Bay shore. The local kids were not allowed to play near or in this lake for safety reasons. Kevin Hjalmarsson never had any issues following this rule because, for one, he didn't know how to swim, and he was also very scared of the water. His grandparents continued to walk around this bay, and then they found Kevin's red bike. It was abandoned, propped up against an old shed. When they saw his bike without seeing Kevin in the same vicinity, their hearts completely sank. Kevin would never abandon his most prized possession. He loved his red bike. They yelled out his name, hoping he was somewhere within distance that he could hear them, but he didn't respond back. At approximately 9:15 p.m., his grandparents began walking toward the shore of the lake, and that's when his grandfather noticed something floating in the water several feet away. He saw a wooden pallet surrounded by reed, and on top of the pallet, he could see the body of a small child. His grandfather flew into the water, and when he got to the pallet, he saw his grandson, Kevin Hjalmarsson, lying face down, and he wasn't moving. He carried Kevin back to the shore to his grandmother, and she took the 4-year-old's body and laid him on the ground and immediately began performing CPR on him. While she was giving Kevin mouth-to-mouth, his grandfather runs to the nearest home to call for an ambulance. Kevin's grandmother did not stop the CPR until the paramedics arrived. It was noticed right away that Kevin's clothes were all dry, and he was missing both of his shoes and his left sock. He was transported to the nearest hospital, but sadly, Kevin Hjalmarsson was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. His cause of death at first was ruled as an accidental drowning, but in Sweden, it is very common. In fact, it's encouraged for investigators to thoroughly investigate all deaths ruled as drownings. So they examined Kevin's body, and when they performed his autopsy, it became instantly clear that Kevin's death wasn't an accident. Kevin had clear, visible bruising to his neck and abdomen, which they initially thought could have been caused by his body rubbing against the wooden pallet while it was floating in the water, but they concluded that the injuries were too severe, so it didn't make sense for the wooden pallet to be the cause. The bruise on his neck was 7 centimeters long. This bruise indicated that someone had killed him by pressing a sharp object against his throat. The pallet Kevin had been found on was approximately above 20 centimeters deep water, which makes Kevin's drowning even more unlikely because it's not a lot of water for a child to drown in, especially when he was on top of this pallet when he was found. The whites in Kevin's eyes showed clear signs of bleeding, which indicated he had suffered from strangulation. Kevin also had bruising to his genitals, and he did have signs of sexual assault. They also found sand in his underwear. The investigators, of course, closed off the area where Kevin had been found. Kriviken Bay happened to be very close in location of the children's school. The following morning, which had been the first day of school, was met with a little chaos. Students, parents, and faculty could see multiple investigators at the scene, but at this point, they did not announce to the community that it was now a murder investigation. They let the locals believe that Kevin's death had been an accidental drowning. While investigators were scouring the area, a couple of students approached one of the officers and gave him a pair of sandals and a single purple sock, which belonged to 4-year-old Kevin Hjalmarsson. The kids who found the shoes and sock found them behind the same shed where Kevin's bike had been left abandoned. The shed was about 30 meters away from where Kevin was found. It was immediately theorized that Kevin had been murdered near this shed, and then afterwards his body was taken to the shore and placed on top of the pallet. What further supported this theory was the same type of sand that had been found in Kevin's underwear was a match to the sand behind the shed. Investigators also found a 1 centimeter thick stick that was broken in half, and it was immediately believed that this stick was the sharp object that was pressed against Kevin's throat. Not surprisingly, with how close the murder scene was to the school, the rumor mill began to fly, and there was no stopping it. Police also began going door to door, asking everyone in the area if they had seen anything that Sunday afternoon. It was during these questions that the locals began to speculate that Kevin did not just accidentally drown in the lake, and they were proven right because on Thursday, August 20th, 1998, a press conference was held, and it was announced to the public that Kevin Hjalmarsson's case was being treated as a murder case. Kevin's entire family were heartbroken for what happened to this little boy. And not only was the family dealing with their grief, but they also received a lot of backlash. Specifically, his mother received a lot of backlash for allowing her young son to travel around with no supervision. And then more rumors about the family started being tossed around, claiming that his mother was partying and not taking care of her children, or that his grandparents were drunks. And this is just so irritating how the community were so quick to put down this family and make up untrue rumors. This family just lost their 4-year-old son and grandson in a horrific way. I can't imagine having to deal with that type of grief. And on top of that, people around you are blaming you for his death. It's horrible to think about. If you follow me on Twitter, I say this all the time. We need to give families time to grieve and show them more respect. This happens in so many cases where the families who had just lost someone they loved and the general public seem to want to pile on and make these family members feel worse by not doing something or telling them they should have done something different to prevent it. Hindsight is 20/20, people. It's not doing anyone any good by blaming the members of the family who, at the end of the day, had nothing to do with the death of their family member. Kevin's parents had been separated prior to Kevin being born, but they had a very decent co-parenting relationship. Kevin's father had just moved closer to the area so he could be with his son more, and he was completely devastated when he found out what happened to his son. So much so that I read he refused to leave his own home for weeks. The family had been, of course, questioned and looked into, and all of them had rock-solid alibis at the time Kevin had been killed. And investigators found no evidence that suggested Kevin's family had been anything but a loving family towards him, and all of them had been immediately ruled out as possible suspects. Due to the signs of sexual assault, right off the bat, everyone working on this case believed that whoever killed Kevin had to have been a pedophile. At the time of this case, there were 3 known pedophiles that had lived in the neighborhood. One of these men had lived only 100 meters away from Kevin's home. The police actually received a tip from a witness who claimed to have seen this pedophile holding Kevin's hand walking down the street in the afternoon of the day he was killed. But they claimed that they looked into this guy and he himself had an alibi and stated he never walked down the street holding Kevin's hand. He completely denied being anywhere near Kevin. The other 2 also had alibis at the time of Kevin's murder, and investigators were unable to link them to this crime, so these men were also quickly ruled out. The news of Kevin's murder was a very hot topic within the community of Arvika. The case received a lot of coverage through local news outlets. There were even daily press conferences that were held to keep the public and media up to date with recent developments in the case. But after they ruled out Kevin's family and the local pedophiles in the area, the case was sort of at a standstill. It's as if they didn't have any other ideas about who could have murdered Kevin. Multiple people were questioned about Kevin's murder, but not a lot came from these questionings. This is when police began to focus questionings on the local children. They figured that since the location of Kevin's death was very close in proximity of the school and football field, there was a great chance that a child could have witnessed what happened that day. Through these kids' questionings, investigators were able to create a very basic timeline of Kevin's movements. A couple of kids came forward letting police know that they had played with Kevin that Sunday morning and afternoon. Kevin was also seen with a 13-year-old boy at a local candy shop in the afternoon. This 13-year-old was questioned, and he was confirmed by multiple witnesses that he was probably one of the last people that saw Kevin that day. They briefly questioned this kid, and he denied being with Kevin at all that day, even though multiple witnesses saw him and Kevin together. But he straight up denied it. He said that wasn't him, people were mistaken. This kid, however, was ruled out very quickly as well because he had an alibi for that night. He claimed to be at the public library until late that Sunday evening, and so they were back to square one again. They interviewed more children, but they weren't able to get a lot of specifics out of them. It's not hard to imagine that the police were under extreme stress about this case. Kevin's murder was gaining national news by this point, and the community suffered from extreme fear and panic, and no one felt safe in Arvika anymore during this time, knowing that there was a child murderer lurking around. So the police knew they had to make some sort of progress with this case to ease everyone's mind. One odd thing about this case, I feel like, is the amount of children who were interrogated and questioned about Kevin's murder. So many kids were interviewed by the investigators for hours, and some of the same kids were interviewed several times. They had now developed the theory that if it wasn't a pedophile who murdered Kevin, then it must have been a kid who killed him. And this is quite a jump, in my opinion, to go from a pedophile murdering and sexually assaulting a young boy to another child committing the same heinous crime. In my opinion, the police were just wanting to solve this case and put the blame on anyone they could at this point. Since they started investigating all of these children, now more rumors were flying across the community. Now the public was even starting to believe that maybe it was another child that had murdered Kevin. Anyone that has a child or spends any time with children on a regular basis knows how unreliable they are. You can all imagine how difficult it was for the investigators to question these kids. Because many of them were so young, they weren't able to ask them complicated questions. They had to ask them simple, straightforward questions in order to get any relevant information from any of them. Remember, most of these kids were not allowed to be anywhere near this lake. When they were asked if they were by the lake, of course most of them who were near the lake that day were going to say no because they didn't want to get into any trouble with their parents. It also became extremely frustrating because some of these kids constantly changed their story. Some of their statements would implicate other children, and then when they would be re-questioned, they would take back everything they initially said and tell the police something completely different. Some of the parents refused to have their children be questioned at all too. These investigators didn't have a clue what they were doing when it came to questioning these young children. They were not used to questioning kids on such a horrific case. They did bring in child professionals such as social workers and child psychologists and therapists to help with the questions. They tried to make these kids feel safe and comfortable by giving them sweets like candy and ice cream before questioning, thinking that this would make them more willing to talk to them. But honestly, at the end of the day, they didn't get a lot of relevant information about Kevin's murder at all. On August 22nd, 1998, almost a week after Kevin Hjalmarsson was killed, a young 5-year-old boy named Robin Dalen and his 7-year-old brother Christian Carlson were in the car riding home with their dad, when all of a sudden, Christian announced that he had seen Kevin talking with a man on the day he had died. Their dad, immediately upon hearing this, turned his car around and headed to the police station so his son could tell them this information. Their dad knew that this information could potentially help solve this case and didn't hesitate bringing any information he could to them. Right before they got to the station, Robin then came out of nowhere and he said that he saw them murder Kevin. Robin was Kevin's best friend. They were always outside playing together. So he and Christian had already been questioned very early on because they were known to be good friends with him. And it had been confirmed that both boys had briefly seen Kevin the day he had died. After Kevin had eaten his lunch, he rode his bike over to the brothers' home to ask if they could come out and play with him around 4 p.m. But they told Kevin that their family had company over and that they were going to eat dinner, then go out fishing afterwards. So Kevin was turned away. At around 5 p.m., Robin and Christian went outside to play with the 3 children of the family friends that were over at their home. By 6 p.m., they came back into the house to get dressed and they all went fishing as planned until late that night on the day Kevin was killed. And there was multiple people that could confirm this. When the boys got to the station, they were both separated into interrogation rooms. The police questioned Robin right away very intensely, pretty much demanding him to tell them anything and everything he knew about the person who murdered Kevin. Let's remember that this is a 5-year-old that's being interrogated. During this first questioning, Robin's stepmother had been in the room, and Robin was a little reluctant to say anything, but she encouraged him to just tell the truth and that he would not be in any trouble if he had rode his bike to the lake that day. Robin denied being at the lake that day, but then he said that the man who murdered Kevin at the lake didn't listen to him. So right away, everything Robin is saying is very conflicting. And at one point, he stated that there were 2 older teenage boys that had been with Kevin and that they had stabbed Kevin in the stomach to kill him. Kevin did not have any stab wounds. So of course, they knew that what Robin was saying wasn't accurate. But they did not want to stop questioning this little boy. In my opinion, they knew they could use what Robin was saying in order to close this case, and ultimately, that's really what they wanted to do. For Christian's first interview, he had told police that on the night of Kevin's murder, Robin had told him that he watched someone kill Kevin. Christian also told them that he had not been there and he did not see anything. The only thing they got from him during this first interview was him claiming that Robin told him that he saw what happened and that he had told Christian that night. The police had interviewed these boys 5 times and accumulated to 4 full hours of questionings between the brothers that day. Their stepmother, who had been in the room during both of the boys' interviews, became so overwhelmed with fear. She was thinking that if Robin had actually seen Kevin's murder, then the killer may come back to murder Robin to make sure he wouldn't say anything. She was so beyond terrified after their first day of interviews that she went into a full-on panic attack and had to be sedated, and she was transferred to a psychiatric ward for 9 days. Robin and Christian were interviewed 7 more times between the dates of August 23rd and September 1st. Every single interview took hours. And after the first initial interview, the parents did not attend any other interview that the brothers had with the police. It's ridiculous that a 5 and 7-year-old's parents were not in the room during these questionings. At first, the police clearly focused more on Robin's interviews than Christian's. Between August 23rd and September 1st, every time they questioned Robin, his stories would change. One minute he would say an adult stabbed Kevin in the stomach, and then the next minute he would say it was an older kid who pushed him into the water. His story never stayed the same. At one point, the police tried to take him to the scene where Kevin was murdered to see if bringing him there would make him remember more clearly what had happened. But even when they took him to the shore, his stories continued to change. They took him around the neighborhood when he claimed at one point he could show them where the killer lived. When they walked around, Robin would just randomly choose a house and knock at the door. And then he would backtrack and lead the investigators to a completely different house. The police gave him a yearbook from the school and asked if Robin could point to the person who murdered Kevin, and Robin would randomly point to a child's picture, then he would change his mind and then point to someone else seconds later. It's obvious to me, and it should be to everyone who researches this case, that Robin was just trying to appease the police. He was guessing and forming stories, and the police were letting him make these guesses, hoping that this 5-year-old would eventually come up with a story that could feasibly match what happened to Kevin, so they could just go ahead and close this case down. They didn't care about the truth. They just wanted to shut this case and move on so the people in the community wouldn't continuously be up their asses, freaking out about a child killer being on the loose. But after several interviews with Robin, the police were getting frustrated with him. They decided to then focus more on Christian, hoping that because he was a little bit older than Robin, he would be able to give them more clear and consistent answers that they were looking for. Initially, Christian continued to say that he didn't witness anything and he wasn't there the night Kevin had been killed. He continued to tell them that Robin was the only one who saw anything that happened that day. But the police continued to press Christian, and then his story began to change as well. He then admitted that he had been with Robin the day Kevin had been killed, and he had also seen the older boys that had killed Kevin. After Robin and Christian were interviewed on September 1st, they were not interviewed again during the entire month of September. During this time, the police had tracked down 2 teenagers and considered them as potential suspects because they had been seen around the area Kevin had been killed the night of his death. These boys are only ever referred to by the first names Marius and Matthias. They were 13 and 14 years old when they were brought in for their questionings. During these interrogations, the police were very harsh when questioning Marius and Matthias. They were yelling at them, telling them that they had been the ones who murdered Kevin and that they just needed to confess to the crime, even though they had no physical evidence or proof linking these boys to his murder. Toward the end of their interviews, the interrogators became so aggressive with their questions that both Marius and Matthias had broken down into tears, but they continued to maintain their innocence and never changed their stories. Both of these boys completely denied any involvement. They never saw Kevin. They didn't talk to him that day. They were adamant and clear with their answers. But these officers obviously didn't want to believe them. They were 100% convinced at this point that it had been another child who killed Kevin. But with no evidence being found to incriminate these boys, they were unable to keep them after their questionings. And after these boys left, even though this is completely illegal, they placed a wiretap on the phones in both Marius and Matthias's home, clearly as a desperate attempt to overhear anything that might incriminate either of these boys to the crime. But of course, this was just another waste of time because they never heard anything worth hearing while they listened in on all of their phone calls. So Marius and Matthias were ruled out as suspects officially at the end of September. With these boys now being ruled out, the police immediately went back to interrogating Robin and Christian. During the month of October, the boys were questioned 9 more times each, and again, their stories continued to change. The method of killing was never the same. Sometimes Kevin was stabbed, other times Kevin was kicked or pushed into the water by someone. And now as the police were getting more and more desperate, somehow, amazingly, they started to believe that Robin and Christian were not witnesses to this case. They now had the bright idea that Robin and Christian had now actually been the ones who murdered Kevin. And let me tell you, I have seen some pretty shitty police work before in many cases, but this is just absolute bullshit. It makes no sense how they came up with this conclusion because, again, they had no physical evidence tying either of these brothers to the scene where Kevin had died. Nothing pointed to Robin and or Christian being the killers. If you remember, the pallet that had held Kevin's body was 30 meters away from where it is believed that Kevin had actually died. It was determined to be impossible that a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old could have carried Kevin's body all the way to this pallet by the shore without there being at least some drag marks in the sand. Kevin had to have been carried all the way to this pallet. Robin and Christian also, if you remember, had a rock-solid alibi that was confirmed by multiple people, their family members, and the family friends that also visited the family that day. The family friends that were over had a 10-year-old son who was also interviewed by the police a couple of times. This 10-year-old said that on the Sunday afternoon in question, his mother told him specifically to keep an eye on Robin, Christian, and his 2 younger siblings because he was the oldest child in the group. He blatantly denied Robin or Christian ever leaving their street between 5 and 6 p.m., which was the only possible time window they could have been at the scene where Kevin had died. But this 10-year-old continued to tell the police that they never left. They were on the street right by their home the entire time. And then by 6 p.m., all the kids went back inside, got dressed, and went fishing for the next few hours. And unbelievably, the police accused this 10-year-old boy of lying so he wouldn't be in trouble with his family for not watching the boys as he was supposed to. But even the 10-year-old's mother, who was still watching the children play outside through the window from inside the house, also told police that Robin and Christian never left the area. And yet, they completely decide to ignore these claims altogether. By late October, based off all of the interviews with Robin and Christian, police had developed a story on what they believed happened to Kevin Hjalmarsson on the evening of August 16th, 1998. They believed that at around 5 p.m., when Robin and Christian were known to be playing outside with 3 other children, they had managed to sneak off without anyone noticing and found Kevin Hjalmarsson, and they began playing together. The 3 boys had traveled to the Krikviken shore and began playing some sort of game by the jetty. And that's when an argument broke out between the boys. And both Robin and Christian pushed Kevin to the ground, started hitting and kicking him, and this ended with Christian pressing the stick against Kevin's throat, killing him. They then somehow carried Kevin's body to the shore, placed his body on the wooden pallet, and set it adrift. They believed that Robin and Christian had been so traumatized by the event that they immediately blocked out the memories of killing Kevin. Now, honestly, does this not sound like the most bullshit story you all have ever heard? I mean, seriously, when you look at the injuries Kevin had received, none of that story really makes any sense besides maybe, possibly, the stick being pressed against Kevin's throat. And which, by the way, at this time, that detail for Kevin's case had not been released to the public yet. This was confidential information. No one had known that Kevin's murder weapon was determined to be this stick. So at the end of October, they once again requested to speak to Robin and Christian. They needed one of the brothers to confess to killing Kevin, but specifically, they needed one or both of them to confess to killing Kevin by pressing a stick to his throat. When it became clear to Robin and Christian's father that his sons were now being questioned as the killers of this case, he also had a mental breakdown and had to be admitted to the psychiatric ward for several days. Thinking that his sons had anything to do with Kevin's death was just too much for him to handle. And I feel so incredibly bad for this family and everything that they all had to go through. So for these last few interviews, an investigator named Ingrid Harrison took Robin back down to the jetty where Kevin was killed. And she had brought this life-size doll with them, and she instructed Robin to reenact what he and his brother had done to Kevin that day. Ingrid repeatedly asked Robin if he or if Christian had done anything to hurt Kevin, and he kept telling her, no, they did not. She then started to encourage Robin to play with a stick that was randomly on the ground, but he just sort of ignored her, and he just stood there, not knowing what the hell he was supposed to do to this doll. With no results from Robin, they then brought Christian out to the jetty, and Ingrid once again tried to encourage now Christian into confessing by asking him if he could point to the location where he had hurt Kevin on the doll. Christian's response to this question was that he didn't know because he was not there when it all happened. He then stated that maybe Robin had pushed Kevin into the water and that that's how he got hurt. But of course, this wasn't what the police were looking for. They wanted the boys to confess to killing Kevin by pressing a stick to his throat. They knew that if they could get at least one of the boys to mention how they killed Kevin with the stick, then they could close this case and put the blame on these boys. On October 26, 1998, the brothers had been called back in for yet another round of interviews. Ingrid, who was now completely frustrated that she wasn't getting what she needed from either boy, she began feeding Robin details of the case that no one in the general public knew about. She drew him pictures of where Kevin's injuries were on his body, specifically the bruising on his neck, and then she also mentioned that a stick had been used on Kevin during this interview. This was the first time that a stick or a bruise on his neck was ever mentioned in any of the interviews. So Ingrid basically just told Robin exactly what they believed happened to Kevin without actually telling him verbatim. Then she asked Robin over 100 times how he put this bruise on Kevin's neck. And each time she asked him, he couldn't give her an answer or he stated he didn't know. And she kept asking him over and over until Robin finally came up with what she took as an acceptable answer. He told her that Christian had pinched Kevin's neck. This wasn't exactly what they needed. Pinching doesn't make the type of wound that Kevin had, so Ingrid kept being persistent, and after 2 hours and 245 questions, she gave up on trying to get Robin to confess. Then it was Christian's turn, and she asked him the same questions she had asked Robin. She showed him the same picture where Kevin's bruise was, but this time she did not mention a stick being involved in his death. Christian kept insisting that Kevin had been killed on top of the pallet, but he wasn't able to articulate how he was killed. The investigators also knew this statement wasn't true because they had already determined that Kevin was most likely killed 30 meters away by an abandoned shed. Ingrid asked Christian how he made the bruise on Kevin's neck after she showed him a photo of where his injury was, and at first he couldn't give a correct explanation either. He was asked 246 questions in total during this interview, and 61 times he cries out that he is too tired to answer any more questions and that he just wants to see his mom. And every time he told her he just wanted to see his mom, Ingrid would tell him that he can see her as soon as he told her what really happened to Kevin. And that is just so brutal. This is a 7-year-old child, and he and his little brother should not have been going through any of this. These investigators are literal pieces of shit. They were leading and forcing these two innocent children into a confession that they obviously didn't and couldn't comprehend. Toward the end of the interview, she brought out another photo and pointed to where Kevin's body had been found, and then she pointed to where the investigators believed Kevin's attack took place. And suddenly it clicked for Christian. He now knew what he was supposed to say. He then said that he and Robin had moved Kevin's body to the pallet from the area by the shed and left his body there. But he still couldn't explain how him and Robin killed Kevin or how they were able to transfer his body the 30 meters from the shed to the shore. By the way, these interviews are available to watch. If you are from Sweden, I highly encourage you to watch them. I've seen a couple of clips, and even though I don't speak the language, I could hear how frustrated everyone was in these interviews. When Robin and Christian are trying to answer these questions, you can hear it in their voices that they don't know, and that they are very frustrated that they can't give the police the answers they clearly want from them. They finally stopped Christian's final interview after 4.5 hours. A couple of hours later, they brought back Robin for another interview. Supposedly, they drilled him with the same questions they had asked him earlier. But conveniently, this interview wasn't recorded with audio or video, even though all of the rest of the interviews up until this one had been. So according to a written report by one of the investigators, Robin all of a sudden broke down, and he told him that him, Kevin, and Christian were playing, and that Christian had pressed the stick to Kevin's throat, and that's how his neck was hurt. Again, there is no proof that Robin had actually said any of this. There's no video. No audio recording of this confession. So did this so-called confession, if you even want to call it that, even happen? Even if it did, this was a 5-year-old little boy who was just coerced into confessing. These boys had 31 interviews and each one of them lasted hours. They hardly got any breaks. They didn't have a parent or guardian with them during the majority of these interviews. From the very beginning, Robin and Christian's interviews were not fair. The story that the investigators came up with doesn't even match fully on what happened to Kevin. He had more injuries besides just this bruise on his neck. He had injuries to his abdomen. There was evidence of sexual assault because he had bruising to his genitals and sand in his underwear. But they did come up with an explanation for that too. They claimed that before Christian had pressed the stick to Kevin's throat, both brothers had pushed Kevin into the sand and kicked him in several areas, including the groin area. Come on. They just make every excuse they could come up with so they could close this case and not have to deal with it anymore. On the following day, they brought Robin in one last time so they could catch his confession on camera. But surprise, surprise, he wasn't able to restate his confession, and it seemed like he couldn't even remember what he had allegedly said to them the day before. So they never got a real confession out of either brother. But apparently it didn't seem to matter because in the first week of November, the investigators held a press conference regarding the case, and they announced to the public that 2 young brothers had confessed to accidentally killing Kevin Hjalmarsson. They announced that it had been a game gone wrong and that they were 100% certain without any doubt that it was these 2 children who had been responsible for Kevin's death. They refused to identify the names of the brothers, and they also let the public know that they would not be pursuing a trial in regards to his death, as the children were deemed too young to be charged with murder. And that was that. The case was now officially closed. Even though the police refused to announce Robin and Christian by name, it didn't take very long for the small community to figure out that it was Robin and Christian that they had been referring to. It wasn't safe for Robin Christian, their father, or their stepmother to return back home with everyone knowing now that Robin and Christian were confirmed responsible for Kevin's death. The family was placed in a treatment center outside of town until the police could figure out what they were going to do with Robin and Christian. The entire family attended therapy sessions to be able to process what Robin and Christian had allegedly done. Robin and Christian were forced to attend their own rehabilitation program and sessions to process what they had supposedly done to Kevin. But not surprisingly, they had a very hard time comprehending these sessions because they couldn't fully grasp the situation at the time since they were so young. They repeatedly asked when they would be going home and returning back to their normal lives. Robin and Christian had undergone various testing. They had brain scans and MRIs done to see if they had any physical or mental abnormalities that could explain why they might have killed Kevin. It's not a secret that child murderers, especially below the age of 11, are extremely rare. For several years, Kevin Hjalmarsson's murder was often compared to the murder of James Bulger, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with that case, James was a 2-year-old boy who was abducted from a shopping mall by 2 10-year-old boys, and he was horrifically tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered by these kids in 1993. The reason I brought this case up is because I think the James Bulger case could have heavily influenced Kevin Hjalmarsson's case. Maybe the investigators had read about James's case and that's how they came up with the idea that Robin and Christian could have murdered Kevin. James Bulger's case was international news when it happened. Nobody wanted to believe such young boys were capable of committing such a heinous murder. And now for Kevin's case, we had a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old who had been confirmed as killers to a 4-year-old. Police attempted to have the boys put into foster homes at one point, but none of the foster homes in the area would willingly take the brothers, now that they were known for killing another 4-year-old child. Since no one was willing to take them, thankfully they were placed back with their family. Robin and Christian spent several more years going to therapy sessions. They were eventually allowed to go back to school. Of course, it had to be at a completely different city, and they had to have an escort with them at all times. And they were not allowed to tell any of the children or anyone else about Kevin Hjalmarsson. After a year of the family living in the treatment center, they were released and were allowed to live together at an actual home. But still, none of them were allowed to speak about Kevin. So from still a very early age, Robin and Christian, who had been blamed for his death, who still didn't have a clue of what really happened to Kevin, could no longer speak his name at all. It was feared by their family that if anyone ever found out that it had been Robin and Christian who had killed Kevin, then they would immediately be in danger. No one takes kindly to known child murderers, and despite Robin and Christian being children themselves, they also had to live with that fear that someone could and would hurt them if people found out about their involvement. Robin and Christian were forbidden from going back to Arvika, Sweden until they reached 18 years old. So their lives were completely stripped away from this. Their childhoods completely ruined. Their families' lives were also ruined. And all of them had to live with the elephant in the room that Robin and Christian were now considered murderers. They tried to live normal lives. They never spoke about Kevin, even within the safety in their own home. It was never talked about. Could anyone imagine having to live this life? Spending basically your entire life believing you had killed another child? Having the stigma in society as you grow up? How many times did Robin and Christian lie awake at night thinking about Kevin? Thinking about the police telling them over and over again that they had taken his life without a shadow of a doubt? I couldn't imagine it. It's absolutely horrendous. Robin and Christian grew up believing that they had been responsible for Kevin's death, even though they had no recollection of killing him or even being with him that day. But they also thought it was possible that they had been involved and just repressed the memories like the police told them that they did. Then in the year 2017, 19 years after Kevin Hjalmarsson had been killed, an investigative journalist named Dan Josefson had been given access to Kevin's case files by an anonymous source. And when he looked through and read all the documents, he was like, "What the hell is this?" He immediately saw several flaws these investigators had made with this case. They had no scientific evidence whatsoever that could pin Kevin's murder to Robin or Christian. Dan then decided to reach out to Robin and Christian's family to share his concerns that there had been a misjustice and that he believed that Robin and Christian were innocent. But when he attempted to reach out to the family, they refused to speak to him. Understandably, the entire family was very hesitant to speak to anyone regarding this case. For years, they were told not to speak to anyone about Kevin Hjalmarsson, and they were still very terrified about someone coming after Robin or Christian if the public knew about their involvement. But Dan was persistent. He kept reaching out to the family for 5 months, begging to speak with them. Then after 5 whole months, they finally agreed to speak with Dan. Dan told them how he and his team were very certain that the investigators completely botched this investigation, and he fully believed that Robin and Christian were innocent. He told the family how terrible the investigation really was, and he also mentioned how he was in process of creating a documentary on this case to reveal the truth, how Robin and Christian had been coerced in the questionings and how there was absolutely no physical evidence linking them to Kevin's death. Dan asked Robin and Christian to come forward to share their story, to finally tell the world that they had no recollection of what happened to Kevin and how they both believed that they were innocent. And as you all can imagine, the family was horrified with the idea of plastering Robin and Christian's face and name in the media. They feared that if Dan and his team were wrong and Robin and Christian revealed themselves to the media, then they could no longer hide and their faces will forever be linked to Kevin's murder. Dan understood these concerns and he promised the family that if he and his team weren't able to find concrete evidence that this investigation was botched, then he would not go forward with the documentary. The family agreed to let Dan and his team complete the research, and if they were able to prove Robin and Christian's innocence, then they would happily come forward and reveal their identities to the public. Dan and his team got to work, and they eventually got their hands on the video interrogations, and when they watched the interrogations of Robin and Christian, they were completely blown away. It's clear that the interrogations were completely unethical and that Robin and Christian only ever gave relevant answers when they were spoon-fed the answers. They also quickly discovered that the investigators completely ruled out a real potential suspect in the case from the very beginning. Remember the 13-year-old boy that was spotted with Kevin by multiple witnesses the day he had died? Well, get this. On May 7th, 1999, which is about 9 months after Kevin's death, a man was taking a walk through the playground near the Creebeacon Lake when he caught the same 13-year-old raping a 3-year-old little boy in the sandpit of the playground. The man immediately intervened and the 13-year-old ran off, but the witness managed to see this kid's face and it was confirmed to be the same kid that was seen with Kevin the day he had died. Since Kevin also had signs of sexual assault, I think this is too big of a coincidence that just 9 months later, this same 13-year-old teen was literally caught in the act of raping a young boy who was around the same age as Kevin. And this playground was only about 100 yards away from where Kevin was found. The 13-year-old immediately fled the city after he was seen by the witness, but he later came back and turned himself in, and he confessed to raping the 3-year-old boy. Since he was only 13 at the time, he was sentenced to a treatment facility. I couldn't find any more information on how long he was in this facility, but it doesn't seem like it was for very long, as he did return back to school within about a year. After this incident, this boy seems to have kept a very low profile, and not much else is known about this kid. His name isn't even 100% confirmed either. Most articles only refer to him as the 13-year-old boy or by the first name Felix. On the day Kevin was found, he had told police he had been at the local library for his alibi. If the investigators even bothered to look into this alibi, they would have quickly discovered that the library he said he was at was always closed on Sundays. Dan knew he was going to find the proof he needed to convince Robin and Christian and their family to come forward, but he didn't expect to find as many discrepancies as he did. He showed the family what he had found and even showed them the interrogation videos, and they were completely appalled by what they saw and how Robin and Christian were treated. They had no idea how pathetic the interrogations were until Dan showed them the videos. The family were now all in with Dan. They trusted Dan now that he wanted the truth to be revealed to the world and wanted to clear Robin and Christian's name. The 3-part documentary series titled Documents from Within, The Kevin Case, was released on Sweden's networks in early May of 2017. Robin and Christian's family were rightfully fearful the day the documentary series was released. They didn't know what to expect from the public, and this was the first time Robin and Christian's full names were released to the public. And instantly, the entire family gained massive support. The community was outraged by the behavior of the investigators who worked Kevin's case. Robin, Christian, and their entire family were so relieved and so grateful for the media and how the truth was finally coming to light. For the first time in their lives, after almost 20 years, they didn't have to live in this fear anymore. They could finally speak out publicly and tell their story. Robin and Christian spoke with the media and they expressed their happiness, but they also were immensely respectful towards Kevin's family and publicly mentioned how excruciating this must be for them, that the truth was coming out after all of these years. They knew that now Kevin's case was getting more and more attention again. They hated the idea that Kevin's family had to go through this nightmare again and relive losing Kevin all over again. During the rest of the year of 2017, the case gained more and more support until it was finally formally reviewed in court for the very first time. The chief prosecutor reviewed the entire case, from the interrogation records to Kevin's autopsy results, and he even interviewed as many as 80 people who had been involved with the initial investigation. Then on March 17th, 2018, a verdict from the prosecutor was revealed in a press conference. He concluded to the public that there was absolutely no forensic evidence that linked Robin and Christian to Kevin's death, nor was there any evidence whatsoever that Robin or Christian had even been present at the time of his death. He also acknowledged that the boys did have a solid alibi the night Kevin had died. And he also acknowledged the fact that the investigators completely fucked up this case. He called the initial investigators unethical and unprofessional on how they treated Kevin's case. He had no doubt that Robin and Christian were completely innocent and had nothing to do with what happened to Kevin Hjalmarsson. Robin and Christian finally, after almost 20 years, were cleared from this case completely. Words couldn't express how overjoyed and relieved they were to finally have been vindicated. But to this day, the question still remains: what happened to Kevin Hjalmarsson on the evening of August 16th, 1998? But the horrific truth of it is, we probably will never know because the investigators ruined this case. So many theories and potential possibilities exist on what happened to Kevin. It seems like a very large percentage of people believe that Kevin was not murdered at all, and it was just an accidental death. Some people believe a pilot could have crushed Kevin, causing him to drown. Some people think he may have been playing by the water with another child, and while playing on the pallet, the unknown child may have sat on top of Kevin, pressing his throat against the wood of the pallet, accidentally suffocating him in the process. In my opinion, these accidental death scenarios don't make a lot of sense to me. Honestly, there was probably a lot more evidence on Kevin's body that was either overlooked at the time or just wasn't discovered because it was the late 1990s and technology was not as it is today. I truly believe that this case is a lot more complicated than an accidental death. My gut instincts believe that it was the 13-year-old boy who killed Kevin. I 100% believe that Kevin was murdered by someone, whether it was accidental or not. But again, the sad reality of this really is that we will probably never know what really happened to Kevin Hjalmarsson. His family now has to live with the fact that the police who they trusted to solve their son's case failed them and failed Kevin. They treated Kevin and his family as if they didn't matter by botching the entire investigation and blaming two innocent children for a crime they did not commit. I don't know if they were just lazy or they just didn't care, but how they treated Kevin's case was completely unacceptable. The only positive thing about this case is that in March of 2022, Robin and Christian received compensation of 1 million krona each from the Swedish government as an acknowledgement of how unethical their treatment was during the investigation, and how Robin and Christian's lives have been negatively impacted for decades because they had been blamed for Kevin's death. Robin, Christian, and their families' lives were ruined for so many years. I feel horrible for what their family had to go through. They lost their childhoods, and they will never be able to get any of those years back. This is definitely one of the most frustrating cases I have ever covered. Kevin Hjalmarsson lost his life at just 4 years old. His death is still a mystery, and if he was murdered, then his killer is still out there, and Kevin and his family still have not gotten the justice or closure that they truly deserve. But as of now, that is all I have for this case. Of course, as always, for the unsolved cases I cover on my channel, I hope that one day I can post an update video for Kevin. It has been almost 2.5 decades since this sweet little boy's life was taken, but I don't ever truly give up on unsolved cases. It is not too late to find the person or the people responsible and give Kevin and his family justice. And if this was somehow an accident, his family still deserves to know without any doubt to what happened to Kevin that day. If anyone has any information, please reach out and report it to the appropriate authorities. Someone out there probably knows what happened to Kevin Hjalmarsson. It only takes one person to speak out for him to get the justice that he deserves. Don't forget, if you have a moment, like and share this video. Comment down below your thoughts about this case. If you liked this video and want to be notified when I post future videos, click on the subscribe button and notifications bell. You do not want to miss out on any cases I will cover in the future. That is it for me today. I'll see you guys next time in case 16. Until then, bye, true crimers.